Thank you very much to Lynn for very kind words of introduction. Thank you to each of you for the work that you do in the trenches each and every day of making this region a healthier place. It is my privilege and honor to be here with you for this important annual event that you hold. I have been here all morning, and I have certainly learned a lot from you and from the conversation that has been taking place. I want to talk a little bit about the work that I do. I do work on racial inequalities in health, and you will quickly see that the drivers of inequalities in health are the drivers of inequality in multiple other sectors of society. So even if you don't do work in the area of health, I hope that you can see important lessons from this work for you. I'm going to jump into the presentation since we've got a lot of territory to cover, and I look forward to a wonderful conversation at the end. So in the United States, race matters a lot for health. There are two global patterns that we find in terms of race and health in the United States. For groups that have been in the United States for a long time, characterized by economic marginalization, geographic isolation, whether you look at American Indian reservations or the segregation of African Americans, social stigmatization, those groups tend to have worse health. That's true for blacks or African Americans. I'll use those terms interchangeably. American Indians and Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, those groups have worse health than the US average. On the other hand, groups that are heavily made up of immigrants, we have an intriguing pattern that emerges. And that is, for example, immigrants of all racial groups have better health than their native-born counterparts. If you look at nationally available data on infant mortality or overall mortality, white immigrants have better health than whites born in the US. Black immigrants have better health than blacks born in the US. Asian immigrants have better health than Asians born in the US. Latino immigrants have better health than Latinos born in the US. Across the board, there's a healthy immigrant effect. That's the good news. The bad news is, the longer immigrants remain in the US, the worse their health becomes. There's a dramatic decline in the health status of immigrants. For example, national data looking at the physiological functioning of Mexican Americans in the US finds, if you look among those 45 to 54, when they arrive in the US, their metabolic profile, looking at 10 indicators of metabolic functioning, is identical to that of whites. By 21 years in the United States, it's identical to that of African Americans. So you see this dramatic transformation of worsening health for groups in the United States by immigrant status. And the disparities in health that we have faced for a long time. So one look at it is looking at life expectancy at birth for 1950 to the present. We only have data on that for blacks and whites that go back that far. And you can see some good news in the data. If we look at life expectancy in 2010 compared to 1950, there was an 8-year gap in 1950. There's a 4-year gap in 2010. So we've made, in fact, remarkable progress. On the other hand, there's some disturbing things in the pattern. The fact that in 2010, there's still a life expectancy gap of 4 years is huge. So let me put that into context. If we froze the life expectancy of whites to the 2010 level, and we have the life expectancy of African Americans improve at the average level at which life expectancy has improved for the last 10 years, it'll take about 25 years to close the gap. Another way to look at the gap is to let's look at the life expectancy of whites in 1950, 69.1 years at birth. And let's ask, how long did it take for African Americans to experience the health that whites had in 1950? 1990, 40 years later. There's a 40-year gap in the health, and in all of the comparisons, if you look at them over time, there's a 30 to 40-year gap in the health of two groups living in the same society. But what does this racial disparities in health really mean? This 4-year gap in health. Let me translate that into a way that scholars have done that is a way that really will bring it home. Scholars have come up and developed a concept they call excess deaths. And excess deaths for the black population means how many black people die each year who wouldn't die if blacks had the same death rates as whites? The answer is over 96,000 black people die annually, prematurely, who wouldn't die if blacks were equivalent to whites. If you divide that by 365, you get there 265 black people dying every day. Imagine a fully loaded jumbo jet with 265 passengers and crew crashing at Washington National, I still say National Airport. At Washington National, at one of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area airports, and everybody on board dying. And that happened today, and the same thing happened tomorrow, and every day next week, and every day next month, and every day for a year. That's what we are talking about, the massive loss of life in the most productive years of life when we say there are racial disparities in health in the United States. How do we understand the persistence of such large disparities in this great country in which we live? My colleague, Nancy Krieger, says that we like to recognize that these issues are very complex, and there's a complex web of causation. There are multiple, it's multifactorial, all of these factors driving it. And she wrote a paper in which she says we need to pay much more attention to the web, the spiders that is spinning the web. Can't just focus on the fact it's complicated, but we need to identify the spiders and destroy them if we will make progress with the web. One of the spiders that is powerfully spinning the web is residential segregation by race. It's a legacy of racism in the United States, and I hope to persuade you with empirical scientific evidence that segregation is a driver of inequalities in virtually every domain of life, including health in the United States. So if we think of where did segregation come from, it is born out of an ideology of inferiority in which some believed it was important to protect themselves, those who were better off, from those who might, in fact, contaminate them. And so in this, it was supported by our judicial system, it was supported by the real estate industry, it was supported by restrictive covenants, and observers of race in American society have argued for a long time that segregation is the key to understanding racial inequality in America. Murdoch said it in 1944, that segregation was basic to understanding racial inequality. Kenneth Clark in '65 said it was the key. The Kerner Commission said it's the linchpin of US race relations. John Sell is a historian at Duke University, wrote a book on the origins of segregation in the US South and South Africa. He argued that the South Africans looked across the Atlantic and looked at what Americans did after the slaves were freed, and they said, brilliant, let's do it. The South Africans, the apartheid was copied from the US. And they said we can tweak it in ways that may even perfect it better. Importantly, John Sell argued in his book, the book is entitled The Highest Stage of White Supremacy, The Origins of Segregation in the US South and South Africa. He argues in his book that residential segregation by race was one of the single most successful domestic policies of the 20th century in the US. Because it's beneath the radar screen, but it has pervasive negative effects on virtually all outcomes, and I'll show you some data on that. Massey and Denton argues it's a key structural factor and the driver of the perpetuation of black poverty in the United States. And you say, well, what does segregation have to do with health? Well, where you live, for most Americans, determines where you go to school. It determines your access to high quality education. It determines your preparation for higher education. It determines your access to employment opportunities. Where you live determines the quality of neighborhood and housing. Where you live determines whether it's easy or difficult to live a healthy lifestyle. Where you live determines access to medical care. So all of these factors have been directly linked in empirical research to segregation. In fact, two of the country's most respected sociologists, two colleagues of mine, William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, studying the 171 largest cities in America, argues that because of segregation, there isn't even one city where whites live under equal conditions to that of blacks. And they concluded that the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the context of black communities. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's commission argued that you can distinguish neighborhoods and communities by whether they are healthy or unhealthy on so many domains of life, in terms of safety, in terms of access to food, in terms of the quality of their environment, in terms of the availability of parks. You can think of on so many access to healthcare services. On so many domains, you can think of communities as healthy or unhealthy, and highly segregated communities are in the US overwhelmingly, in most cases, unhealthy. I think it's important for me to make the point that there is nothing inherently negative about living next to someone of your own race. So the problem of segregation in the United States is not segregation per se, but it's what William Julius Wilson calls the concentration effects. It's the concentration of poverty and negative social ills that cluster together. For example, in metropolitan Chicago, the correlation between percent poor among elementary school children and percent black and Latino, percent poor compared to percent black and Latino, the correlation is 0.90. If you know percent poor, you know percent black and Latino. So the majority, there are more poor white kids than poor Latino kids in the US now. There are more poor white kids than poor African American kids in the US right now. But most poor white kids go to schools where the majority of kids are middle class. Most poor Latino and African American kids go to school where the majority of kids are poor. If you're a teacher and you have 20 students in your class, if 3 of those students is poor, that's a very different scenario than if you have 20 students in the class and 17 are poor. You now become the social worker. So it changes the dynamic. It's the concentration of social ills. How powerful is segregation? David Cutler, until recently the dean of the social sciences at Harvard University, one of the country's leading economists, did a study using econometric strategies I cannot even fully describe to you. But he is empirically able to document, using the best scientific methods, studying a cohort of African Americans and whites in the United States, that if you could statistically eliminate segregation, you would completely wipe out black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce black-white differences in single motherhoods by 2/3. All of that driven by segregation, by place. Place matters a lot for outcomes. And so in the United States, because I just showed you segregation determines racial differences in income, education, occupation. These racial differences in income and in rates of poverty are not acts of God. They're not random events. They didn't just emerge out of thin air. They reflect the successful implementation of social policy, and that's what segregation was. It was social policy. And so it has led to large racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status. How big are the racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status? Here is data from a 2014 report from the United States Census showing median household income in the US by race in 2013, and I've put it in a way that you can't miss. So for every dollar of household income white households have, Asian households have $1.15. Asians is a category, a very diverse category, made up of multiple population groups, 70% of whom are immigrants, 70% are immigrants. Asians as a group have twice the level of college completion compared to whites, for example. So you're looking at a very high level, high human capital group that has recently come to the United States. Even so, if I was showing you a per capita, per person income, whites have the highest level of per person income. Asian households also have more income contributors, more persons in the household contributing to overall income. So that explains their higher level of income. But importantly, for every dollar of household income white households have, Latinos have 70 cents and African Americans have 59 cents. Do you know what is stunning about that 59 cents level? In 2013, black households earned 59 cents for every dollar white households earned. That is identical to the racial gap in income in 1978. 1978. Most Americans, most of my students, think we have made such remarkable progress since the civil rights movement. The 1978 was the peak level of black income from the gains of the civil rights movement. Throughout the 80s, we fell from the 1978 level, and it wasn't until 1994 that blacks got back up to where they were, to the 59 cents level, and had been on an upward trend later in the 90s, and now it's been going back and forth, and they're now on a downward trend. But it dramatically illustrates that we haven't made as much progress as most of us think we have. Racial differences in income dramatically understate the true degree of racial economic inequality. To capture that, you need to look at wealth. Income captures the flow of resources into the household. Wealth, or net worth, tells us something about the economic reserves that household has. So again, using census, the 2014 report, the latest data on wealth differences by race in this country, you see for every dollar of wealth that white households have, blacks have only 6 cents and Latinos have 7 cents. So you understand why black and Latino households are one paycheck away from being homeless. Because when there's no economic reserves, when there's no additional source of income, another way of saying this is the minority poor are poorer than the white poor because of the lack of economic reserves and income. So I'm saying segregation has contributed to racial differences in socioeconomic status, which are still large and pervasive, and that helps to explain why there are racial differences in health. Because across the world, the single biggest predictor of variations in health is socioeconomic status. Doesn't matter what country you go to, whether they have a healthcare system, universal healthcare access or not, you tell me something about an individual's socioeconomic status, I can tell you much about their health. Here is national data for the US showing the relative risk of premature mortality, that is defined as death before the age of 65, by family income. And what this shows is that low-income Americans, as a relative risk scale, low-income Americans are 3 times more likely to die before the age of 65 compared to high-income Americans. So the World Health Organization points out that socioeconomic status shapes opportunities to be healthy from the cradle to the grave. And that's why it's such a powerful predictor of variations in health. When I started my career some couple decades ago, most people believed that the racial gap in health was simply a matter of socioeconomic status. And if we looked at blacks and whites at the same level of income and education, there would be no effective race because it was driven completely by socioeconomic status. We now know that life is more complex. So here is national data for the United States showing life expectancy at age 25, and at age 25, the average white person lives 5 years longer than the average African American. If you look at the variations within whites by education, you can see that whites who have a college degree live 6.4 years longer than whites who have not finished high school. Importantly, that 6.4-year variation within whites is bigger than the black-white gap. And within African Americans, you also see a 5.3-year variation between low education and high education African Americans. At the same time, at every level of economic status, there still is a racial gap. So white high school dropouts still live 3.1 years longer than black high school dropouts, and the difference is even larger among the college educated. This slide should be really, you should take a minute, a few seconds to let it sink in, because it says there are powerful forces linked to income. I'm showing you education, the income data is very similar. There are powerful forces linked to income and education, socioeconomic status, that shapes outcomes. This shapes health, but it shapes everything else. There are also powerful forces, nonetheless, linked to race that also matters. So we need to think of a strategy that addresses the socioeconomic inequalities, but think of what else we do because there is an added burden of race. Race still matters even after we've taken socioeconomic status into account. And one of the ways in which race matters, in addition to the effect of segregation, is there is individual discrimination. The evidence is overwhelming, high quality scientific evidence that there are racial differences in exposure to discrimination, whether it's in an application for bail, whether it's being arrested for drug crimes or being stopped by the police, whether it's the price offered when you're purchasing a new car, whether it's the cost of a mortgage or whether you have access to a mortgage, whether it's even trying to get a taxi. The scientific evidence is overwhelming that in multiple domains of life, discrimination matters. In the interest of time, I'm going to show you, just talk quickly about two. Audit studies is the best scientific evidence. You hold everything identical, and I'm going to describe two audit studies quickly that shows you the persistence of discrimination. Deva Pager, a sociology graduate student at the time at University of Wisconsin-Madison, took two African-American males and two white males, give them identical resumes, dress them similarly, and send them to apply for entry-level jobs in Milwaukee. She threw a wrinkle into the audit study, have one of them say, of one of the white males and one of the black males, that he had served a prison sentence for cocaine possession. He was now out on parole. She found what you would expect to find. Whether you were black or white, if you had a criminal record, you were less likely to get a call back for a job. But she also found what we didn't expect to find. It was easier for a white male with a criminal record, 17%, to get a call back for a job than a black male whose record was clean. The resumes were identical. She repeated the study in New York City and found exactly the same thing. A white felon is more likely to get a call back for a job than a black or Latino with a clean record. One of the more recent studies that just shows how pervasive discrimination is. They looked at, does your race make a difference? If you stand at a crosswalk positioned to cross the street, does your race make a difference in terms of how drivers treat you in crossing the street? And this study, just done last year, documented that drivers are less likely to yield to blacks standing at a crosswalk compared to whites, and that blacks wait longer at a crosswalk to cross the street. It's just one example. I could go on for hours with examples of the persistence of discrimination in American society. Why does this matter? The research clearly documents that these experiences of discrimination, some of which minorities are not even aware of, because you don't know every time you've been discriminated against, but there's some experiences you're aware of. It has profound consequences for health. So I'll give you an example using my scale, which is just one of the many measures of discrimination out there, the everyday discrimination scale, that is capturing not the big things of discrimination, not getting a job, not getting a promotion, but the day-to-day little indignities. How often are you treated with less courtesy or respect than others? How often you receive poorer service than others at restaurants or stores? How often do people act as if they think you are not smart or if they are afraid of you? How often do people act as if they think you are dishonest? Just the little things. I will show you the work of one researcher using this measure in each study. Each line of this slide represents a different study. Dr. Tenney Lewis finds higher levels of everyday discrimination, statistically adjusting for other risk factors for disease, predicts higher levels of coronary artery calcification. That's following people over 5 years and looking at the subclinical development of coronary disease in their arteries. Discrimination is literally causing heart disease. Higher levels of C-reactive protein, a measure of systemic inflammation in the body. Higher levels of blood pressure. Among pregnant women who report discrimination, they give birth to lower birth weight infants. Among a sample of the elderly, followed over time, more rapid declines in cognitive functioning over the 5-year follow-up window linked to experiences of discrimination. People who report this everyday discrimination sleep poorer quality sleep at night. One study of the elderly followed over time, high levels of discrimination literally is killing people, higher risk of mortality independent of other risk factors. And finally, a study of black and white women, higher levels of everyday discrimination, unrelated to waist circumference, unrelated to waist-hip ratio, unrelated to subcutaneous abdominal fat. They use imaging to separate subcutaneous fat is the fat just under your skin. The really bad kind of abdominal fat that increases your risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other problems is called visceral fat. It's a deep fat between your body organs. Among black and white women, high levels of everyday discrimination predicts high levels of visceral fat. I want to say something because I said among black and white women. What we have found in the studies of discrimination is that minorities are not the only people who experience discrimination. Persons of all racial groups experience discrimination. What we find, though, is minorities experience much higher levels of discrimination. But so far, what the research indicates, when whites experience discrimination, the effect is identical. So importantly, there's a take-home message here for all of us. How we treat people matters, not just for if they're having a good day. It matters for how long and how well they live. So the nature and so the kind of very toxic environment, political and otherwise environment we are in, is going to have pernicious adverse consequences for health. Importantly, though, I'm showing you that the research is documenting that discrimination, in fact, matters for health. As we think of the house that racism built, we've talked about how racism and the larger society created segregation, created individual discrimination. These are pathways by which health is affected. But it is also the cultural racism has also created stereotypes and implicit and explicit bias and negative stigmas. And these also matter for our health. I want to give you an example of this. Scholars, it's amazing what researchers do. They have put together a database of American culture, a database of 10 million words. It captures the average books and magazines and articles and newspapers that a college-educated American would read over their entire life. The beauty of this is if you now have American culture in a database, you can look at, for example, when the word black appears in American culture, what adjective tends to co-occur with black? Well, when black occurs in American culture, it's most closely associated with the word poor, and violent, and religious, and lazy, and cheerful, and dangerous. When white occurs, wealthy, progressive, conventional, stubborn, successful, educated. For the fun of it, when female occurs, distant, warm, gentle, passive. Male, dominant, leader, logical, strong. This is a profound point, and I don't want you to miss it. Because if you look at the 10 most common words co-occurring with black and white, you can see there are negative images for whites also. The size of that number, the closer it is to 1, the stronger, the more tightly that association occurs. So importantly, this helps to explain a lot of what has been happening around race in the United States. The police officer who in a split second perceives a black male as violent and dangerous is not a bad cop. He's a normal American. He is reflecting what he has seen over his lifetime. He is reflecting his socialization, and he's acting on that which American society has given him. We are all products of our culture. We are all products of our socialization, and there's an amazing body of scientific research that finds, although we think that much of what we do is driven by our decisions and conscious, rational choices that we make. In fact, some experts predict that as much as 90% of our behavior and our attitudes are driven by unconscious, implicit processes that we're not aware of. We just feel like it. And importantly, the research is very clear that when you hold negative implicit biases about a group and you meet someone from that group, my next 2 words are important. It's automatic and it's unconscious. You will treat that person differently. That is, you will discriminate against that person with absolutely no intent on your part. You didn't decide to do it. If I ask you, you did it, you'd say no, and you're not lying because there was no intent. You're unaware of it. And it's a normal human process. By the way, I'm discussing it about race, and race has been salient in our history. This is not just about race. This is about how our human brain functions, and it applies to all social categories. So if you, based on your socialization, have negative implicit biases about gay people, about fat people, about women, about old people, the same processes operate. Without your conscious awareness, when you meet someone who falls into this group, even if you are egalitarian in principle, it's not about what your egalitarian attitudes are, it's what's in your mind. You will treat that person differently and not be aware that you actually did it. Let me give you one example of this in the area of healthcare. The Institute of Medicine in 2003 produced a report entitled Unequal Treatment. I served on that committee back then. And what the report found, that across virtually every therapeutic intervention in the United States, blacks receive poorer quality care and less intensive care than whites. Most American doctors do not wake up in the morning and say, how can I get my minority patients today? But yet we have a pattern of care that is explicitly discriminatory. Let me give you one example so it becomes concrete. Dr. Todd was an emergency room physician at UCLA Medical Center. He asked a simple question. When a patient walks into the UCLA emergency room with a long bone fracture, that's a broken bone in the arm or leg, does the patient's ethnicity make a difference with whether the patient gets pain medication or not? Okay? Patient with a broken bone, does the patient get pain medication? He looked at records for an entire year and found that 55% of Latino patients with a broken bone in the arm or leg did not get pain medication, compared to 26% of non-Hispanic whites. Dr. Todd was a good researcher. He said, confounding. There's something else that's driving it. So statistically, he controlled for whether the person spoke English or not, whether they got injured on the job or not, or what time they showed up at the emergency room, how long they spent in the emergency room, the severity of the fracture, where after statistically taking all of those factors into account, the single biggest predictor of whether a patient got pain medication was the patient was Latino. Dr. Todd moved from UCLA to Emory University in Atlanta, repeated the same study at the 3 largest emergency rooms in Atlanta looking at black and white patients, found exactly the same thing. A black person who shows up in an emergency room in Atlanta with a broken bone in the arm or leg is less likely to get pain medication compared to a white patient. How do we make sense of that? Implicit biases. What percentage of Americans have implicit biases against blacks? All groups in the United States, with the exception of one, the answer to that question is 70 to 80%. There's 70 to 80% of whites, of Asians, of Latinos, 70 to 80% of doctors, of lawyers, of teachers. Every group that has been studied all fall within the 70 to 80%. The only group that is lower is blacks. Among blacks is 30%. So still 1 in 3 blacks have the same processes. This is not, because it's not about skin color. It's not about your skin color, it's what's in your mind. Okay? It's not about skin color, it's what's in your mind. And this drives these processes that occur. So we're talking about multiple ways in which discrimination can affect health. And then the individual discrimination and segregation combined with implicit biases leads to the racial inequalities we see in health and in education and in so many other domains of society. And what we find, because of the racial inequalities in all of these domains of societies, they reinforce the stereotypes and make the stereotypes real stronger. So you see, I come back to the stereotypes that drive them, and then they interact with each other, because the higher levels of stereotype, there's studies I'm not going to bore you with, that shows one of the drivers of segregation today is negative stereotypes of blacks. They've done these studies where they've shown white people the same neighborhood, and whether you put a picture of 3 people in the neighborhood, just standing outside, dressed similarly, you can put 3 white people, or you put 2 white people or 1 black person. If there's a picture of a black person, whites rate the neighborhood better on 5 domains that matter to home buyers. They believe the schools are worse, they believe the crime rate is high, they believe that property values will decline more rapidly, just the presence of a black in the neighborhood. So the stereotypes, in turn, maintain the structure of segregation, and so we have this complex system moving forward. How do we undo racism? How do we dismantle racism? Barbara Reskin is a sociologist. She importantly argues that racism, we tend to think of it as a piece of this or a piece of that, but racism is actually a system. And that the fact that it's a system has important implications. It means that discrimination in one societal domain is not independent of other domains. But racism, all the systems are dynamically related and reinforce each other. And there's reciprocal causality, which means they go back and forth. And it is impossible, she argues, to come up with remedies for disparities in one domain if you fail to acknowledge and address the interdependence among the different pieces. It's a huge task. It means then, this is her model of all the ways, she calls it, the different systems of racism work together in society. How do you change it then? You need to have some powerful external force that acts on every aspect of the subsystem, because if there are all of these pieces that work together, or you can act on key leverage points. Importantly, she argues that residential segregation by race is one of the key leverage points, that if you could change segregation, it will have ripple effects on multiple other domains. She also says you could remove institutions from the discrimination system, and she gives the military as an example of that, where there's less racial inequality in the military than in civilian society because of the principles that they have implemented and the way they have implemented it. But she does talk about then the complexity of racism if we are going to address it effectively. I have a paper about talking about the ways in which the evidence of addressing it comprehensively. Let me just highlight a couple quickly, and I'm going to stop so you can ask me questions. One of the important take-home messages then is that improving health, but improving everything else in society, we need to think of how we improve neighborhood quality and quality of housing. We need to think of how we address quality of education. We need to think of how we start early, because what happens early in life puts the child on a trajectory for academic success, for health success, for everything. We need to think of how we even transform our healthcare system to provide health, and not only health care, but what we can do within the healthcare system to promote health. One example of the comprehensive approach that I would want you to think about is the purpose-built societies model. The East Lake District in Atlanta is the first example of that. It's an example of where community leaders and philanthropy came together and said, we are going to tackle the problems of East Lake, the worst performing community in the greater Atlanta area, all at once. We are going to address crime and unemployment and education and access to economic development all at once. And the results have been remarkable. They have seen a 95% reduction in crime since it started in 1995. The employment rate of low-income persons has gone from 13% to 70%. There's been striking changes in school achievement. Their school went from only 5% of students performing at grade level to 95% of students performing at grade level. The purpose-built model is being replicated in other places, but it's an example of not taking a piecemeal approach, but saying, let's tackle all of the social ills together to make a difference. That's the kind of thing it will take for systemic change. Another quick example I want to give you is the Great Smoky Mountain Study. It's a study of researchers have been following a cohort of individuals, of teens in North Carolina, and what they found was during the course of the study, Native American households got, because a casino opened in a nearby reservation, got annually an additional amount of money that they weren't planning on. And they have now assessed what impact did that have. It has led to improved health for Native American kids as teenagers that continued into young adulthood. It has eliminated the American Indian white gap in high school graduation, and it has eliminated racial differences in minor criminal offenses simply by the provision of additional income to poor Native American households, dramatic effects on a lot of distant upstream effects. The final example I want to give you of success is the civil rights movement in the United States. Between the mid-1960s and mid-1970s, there was, as I said, dramatic increases, reductions in the black-white gap in income. And in the last 60 years, the one window of time where we had the health of African Americans improving more rapidly than the health of whites was between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s. Exactly when the income gap between blacks and whites narrowed, the health gap also narrowed. And what happened after 1978? You can see the 59 cents in 1978. The health of Africa, the income gap fell throughout the decade of the 80s. And here's life expectancy at birth from 1984 to 1992. For 5 years in a row after the mid-1980s, you can see the life expectancy of blacks absolutely falling, getting worse from the 1984 level. So when the economic situation worsened, the health situation also worsened. Why should we care about this? It's about all of us. The health of America and the well-being of America depends on the health of all of us. Too many Americans are suffering from health problems that they shouldn't. When people get sick, it affects their productivity, it affects our global economic competitiveness. We all need to do better. I see my colleague, Dr. Steve Wolf, sitting here, who chaired an influential Institute of Medicine committee that showed that the best off people in the United States are not achieving a level of health that they could and are doing worse than their peers in multiple other countries. Another window on that is this report that shows in the United States in 2011, the US ranked 27th in the world on life expectancy. Much worse than we did in 1980, where we were 11th in the world. And we rank behind countries like Greece and Slovenia and South Korea and Lebanon and Costa Rica, where the health of people there are better than the US. And if you think it's just the minorities doing badly, no. If white America were a country, it would still rank 27th in the world. If black America were a country, it would rank 73rd in the world. So all of us need to improve, and the strategies we implement that will be disproportionately beneficial to the disadvantaged have to help all of us. There are wonderful resources like a report from the Center for American Progress, From Poverty to Prosperity. The Robert Wood Johnson Commission's report on natural causes is a wonderful resource. All in Nation, another wonderful resource. The Business Case for Racial Equity from the Kellogg Foundation, another resource. Racism in multiple forms, I'm concluding, has pervasive negative effects on health. We need to better understand them, but more importantly, we need to come together, put our minds together, and implement the kind of strategies that will make a difference. We don't want equality, which is sameness, giving everybody the same. What we need is equity, giving everyone access to the same communities. As Thomas Jefferson said, there is nothing so unfair as the equal treatment of unequal people. I've talked about unequal people today. There's nothing so unfair as the unequal treatment of unequal people, the equal treatment of unequal people. I leave you with the words of Robert Kennedy. Each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And those ripples can build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. There are mighty walls of oppression and resistance in the US. But you, I believe, each one of you, can be a ripple of hope that can make a difference in this region and can serve as a model for this country of how we can treat everyone, to give everyone the opportunity to achieve everything that American society offers. Thank you very much.
The house that racism built caused me to imagine a house with a hole in its roof with rain pouring in. I imagined that the people inside employed strategy after strategy to protect themselves from the elements, to make things better. I imagined that they walked around with umbrellas or created systems of buckets for carrying water out to prevent flooding. I imagined that people inside started fighting each other because they had become miserable and tired. I imagined that some people gave up under the relentless downpour, and others pointed their fingers saying, "It's your fault you're wet, and you're not pulling your weight to keep us dry." My name is Unique Redwood.
My name is Nat Chioki Williams.
My name is Jennifer Lockwood Shabbat.
My name is Wilton Corcoran. I was born and raised in Washington Parish, Louisiana. I grew up in a segregated town. I went to segregated public schools. I went to segregated public university. I would say that for the first 20 years of my life, I never really thought about race or racism. I would say that for the first 20 years of my life, I never really thought about race. I would say that for the first 20 years of my life, I never really thought about race or racism. If I did think about race at all, it was in absolute terms. One was either white or not.
The first time that I was profiled in a shopping mall and accused of shoplifting and taken in the back, and I realized that there was really not a lot that you can do about how people perceived you. To some degree, what they did to you, you had to carry yourself in the way that you could best. But even with that, anything could happen. I can go out of my house and anything can happen to me in the street. Anything can happen. I can go out of my house and anything can happen to me in the street based on anything can happen to me in the street based on anything can happen to me in the street based on the way that other people perceive who I am or who I'm not.
I know that part of why I sought out a PhD was to be able to feel like I had a voice. And there are people who don't have to do that. They don't have to do all kinds of extra things just to have a voice. I just wonder what that's like. What must it be like to just be, just show up, just to have a voice? I just wonder what that's like. What must it be like to just be, just to have a voice? I just wonder what that's like. What must it be like to just be, just show up, feel naturally empowered, and not have to prove anything?
I happened to be in New York City last year on the day that the Eric Garner decision was announced. And on one side of the street, there are the barricades, and you go to the right, you would go into Rockefeller Center where the tree lighting was. And then on the other side of the street is where all of the protesters were. I mean, that stark delineation and division just really rocked me profoundly. I just felt like I couldn't not be there in that moment, standing on the side of the protesters, in amongst them, but that at the same time recognizing, as a white woman, I have privilege and I could choose which side I wanted to stand on.
My father-in-law witnessed a lynching in his hometown in the 1920s. And a few years ago, I read a book which recounted the murder of a black deputy sheriff near my home that took place while I was in college. Nobody was ever held accountable for any of those. Obviously, things have changed, but what strikes me is that we still live with all of those events and many, many others that we don't know about.
In saying that Black Lives Matter, it's a moment and a movement towards stopping the violence against us. And again, it's not just police violence, it's violence in terms of housing discrimination and employment discrimination and educational injustice and healthcare, all the different issues, all the different aspects of Black life where we don't matter, and where there are systematic and structural barriers that have been put in place historically that keep us from thriving and reaching our full potential. All of these things are called into question now in this moment. All of these things are called into question now in this moment. All of these things are called into question now in this moment. All of these things are called into question now in this moment.
I do believe all lives matter, right? Or maybe I believe all lives should matter. I don't believe that they all matter right now. The idea that whites are superior and that Black people are inferior is part of everything. It's part of our news, it's part of our magazines, it's part of our books. It is so pervasive. And I think that we haven't done enough to pay attention to what we're consuming, right? That tells us that Black people are somehow inferior and white people are superior.
I think sometimes when you see something on TV or on the internet or you listen to it on the radio, you tend to think, well, that was there. That's not going to happen in my backyard. That won't happen in my city. It's not going to happen in my neighborhood. And the reality is, it will. This will happen here. It will. This will happen here. It will. This will happen here. There's no doubt about it. So what are we doing as a community? I know that I will never experience so many of the things that women of color in our community are experiencing by virtue of the fact that I am white. But I don't want that to hinder me. I don't want that to cause me to sort of sit in my office and close my door and think about it internally and not do anything about it.
I believe that until we put racism on the table, we can never understand all the rest of the conundrum that is our complicated and conflicted and unequal society.
We're serious about our missions, and most of our missions have something to do. If we're serious about our missions, and most of our missions have something to do with improving the lives, improving the conditions of those who are least well off, or creating greater opportunities for those who have less opportunity right now. Fundamentally, what that requires is courage. The philanthropic sector needs to fully embody the courage that's necessary, the courage that's necessary to make the changes that are imagined in our missions. A courage to not look away, a courage to not look away, a courage to not look away from the deprivations and just the plain things that are wrong that we see, the courage to try to push ourselves to act in different ways, the courage to try to push ourselves to act in different ways, the courage to try to push ourselves to act in different ways, to create fundamental structural change.
It's the sense of, good God, it's 2015. What is going on? Good God, it's 2015. What is going on? It's the sense of, good God, it's 2015. What is going on? And not wanting to say that in 2030 or 2050. I want something better. And so that's what inspires me. I want something better. And so I want something better. And I want something better. And so that's what inspires me every day. That it really is about changing our community for the better. And when that happens, then everybody wins. And when that happens, then everybody wins.
I think I've just decided that even if I can't see it, probably won't see it, the thing that's in my head, where Black people, people of color get to express their full humanity. And, I just don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, as hard as that is to say. And so I just believe in just putting one foot in front of the other. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about progress or thinking about the ultimate goal. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about progress or I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about progress or thinking about the ultimate goal. I just believe that I've just got to keep going. Just keep moving. 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 Just keep moving.